The Trump administration also appears to be taking steps to gut the Department of Education. Sources tell ABC News people working with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency were spotted at the DOE yesterday. Let's bring in Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas for more on all of that. Senator, thank you for coming on. Sources tell ABC News President Trump could soon sign an executive order directing the Secretary of Education to dismantle the Department of Education. Now, Congress would need to pass the necessary legislation in order to shut the DOE. So would you support that?
Well, listen, the policy of shutting down the Federal Department of Education is a policy I have long supported. If you look at the Department of Education, what it ends up doing is putting enormous bureaucratic strings on teachers, on schools, on education. It puts Washington in charge of what's taught to our kids. I think education ought to be a state matter, and even better, a local matter. And I'll tell you, Diane, in the last 4 years in the Biden administration, the Department of Education became an avenue for pushing radical and extreme policies, such as extreme transgender policies, were coming from Washington and being forced on schools across the country. And so I think President Trump is responding to the will of the voters in seeking to shut it down and to bring the power back to the states and back to the people.
Now, we spoke to the former Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, a little while ago on this. He says the Department of Education doesn't dictate curriculum at all. And he also said if the department is eliminated, students with disabilities would be affected because the department makes sure they have what they need to succeed, and that students in rural communities would suffer because they rely on federal funding more than urban areas do. So how would you ensure those students have their educational needs met if the DOE is dissolved?
Well, listen, I think the funding you can block grant to the states so that the dollars make it to the states without all the overhead, without all the bureaucratic weight of Washington. But, you know, it really is striking. You mentioned Secretary Cardona. You look at the last 4 years, and Joe Biden and the Democrats presided over the greatest learning loss in the history of the United States of America. Coming after COVID, Democrats across this country shut down schools, and for many schools kept them shut down for over a year. Tens of millions of school children went a year or longer without going to in-person learning. That was devastating. I was leading the fight to reopen the schools, to get the kids back in schools. We're now seeing the data, and the learning loss that those children are facing is irreparable. They've fallen further behind than any generation since we recorded results. And I'll tell you, as a result of the Democrats' school shutdowns, African Americans have fallen further behind than ever before. Hispanic children have fallen further behind than ever before. So the moralizing of the previous Department of Education is a little rich, given that their policies will go down in history as utterly devastating.
Senator, I want to move on to USAID because President Trump says he doesn't think he needs congressional approval to shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development. But the agency's funds were appropriated by Congress. So should lawmakers surrender that power of the purse?
Well, listen, I fully expect there are going to be battles back and forth between the president and Congress, and there's also going to be litigation. But let me be clear, when it comes to USAID, it has been a problem for a long time that they have flowed millions of dollars in complete darkness without transparency, and much of it has gone to enemies of America. The previous administration, I held up the confirmation of the Middle East director for USAID because USAID was sending millions of dollars into Gaza that was going directly to Hamas and being used to fund terrorism, and they were hiding it. They were trying to keep it in darkness. This has been a persistent pattern, and so I think President Trump and Elon Musk are perfectly reasonable in saying we're going to halt what you're doing right now. We're going to take a look at what exactly is going on, where is the money going, and we're going to make sure that the money is not going to support enemies of America, is not going to undermine U.S. national security. There is an appropriate role for aid when it is advancing American interests, when it is advancing and helping our allies, but indiscriminately shoveling millions of dollars out the door, particularly when it goes to our enemies, that doesn't make sense, and that's what President Trump's trying to stop.
You just announced you're the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health, and many organizations in Africa say USAID's funding is critical, especially in the fight against AIDS. Are you worried about the effects this could have? Because some of these areas describe themselves like a flight in process. If you hit pause, it doesn't actually just pause. It can end the program in the way it works.
Well, listen, there is no doubt there is funding, particularly when it deals with fighting contagious diseases, fighting whether it's AIDS or malaria. That funding is very important. It has saved countless lives. That is critical funding. I believe, however, that U.S. foreign aid should be directed to advancing American interests, that we should be using it, that we're not simply a charity for the world, rather we should be using aid to incentivize countries to act according to our interests, to act alongside us, and we should be using aid as well. We should be withholding aid when you have countries that are actively fighting against America and seeking to harm American citizens. And under Joe Biden and the Democrats, they did not use aid to support our friends and to put pressure on our enemies. If anything, they did it the opposite way. They sent money to our enemies and did very little for our friends. I think that was backwards.
And Senator Cruz, you're also the chairman of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. I know you've been following the investigation into that deadly mid-air collision near D.C. very closely. What are you learning about what may have caused that crash?
Well, the investigation is still ongoing. I've had multiple conversations with the Secretary of Transportation and with leadership at the FAA and leadership at the NTSB that is investigating the crash. We do not know definitively the cause, and any time there is an aviation disaster, especially one with a loss of life, there is a serious investigation that follows the evidence. We've recovered the black boxes, the flight recorders. We know that the American Airlines flight was landing. It had been moved from runway 1 to runway 33, and we know that a military Black Hawk helicopter with 3 soldiers on board had been moved from helicopter route 1 to helicopter route 4. That helicopter was supposed to be no higher than 200 feet above the ground. It appears that helicopter was significantly higher than that ceiling. And at this point, the investigation needs to discover what went wrong. There obviously were massive and catastrophic mistakes, and the investigation is going to determine whether the mistakes were made by the pilots of the helicopter, by the air traffic controllers, by the jet pilot, although the American airline flight, at least on the appearances, was doing a standard landing, so it seems least likely that there was an error there. But we need to investigate the facts and find out what happened. I got to say, it is horrific what happened. 67 souls were lost. You know, I'll tell you, Diane, just on a personal level, my wife, Heidi, was in the air landing at Reagan Airport within about 30 minutes of when that crash happened. She was scheduled to land, and at the last minute, they diverted her to BWI, Baltimore-Washington Airport instead. Look, it is frightening. People count on air travel being safe. And so I'm committed to ensuring that we have an investigation that focuses on the facts, that gets to the bottom of what caused it, and we need to make whatever changes are necessary to prevent a horrific tragedy like this from happening in the future.
And Senator, I did hear you relay that story about your wife. I'm glad she's okay. I can't imagine how scary that was for you before you knew that she was okay.
Your heart literally skips a beat, and so it was. I will tell you, when she landed and got home, I gave her an extra long hug that night. But, you know, there's 67 men, women, and children whose families could not give them a hug that night, and it truly was a tragic situation.
And President Trump, Senator, and some of his allies have claimed DEI initiatives could have played a role here, even though he did admit that he has no evidence for that. And even though DEI programs don't apply to air traffic controllers, which is who he was talking about at the time, you have cautioned against speculating on the cause of this crash before it's fully investigated. So what's your message to those who are pushing this narrative?
Look, I think we ought to focus on the facts and evidence and discover what led to this horrific accident. And we ought to be driven by what the investigation uncovers. The NTSB, I've gotten to know the chairman of the NTSB very well. They do serious, professional, apolitical investigations. I've been impressed by the NTSB. They don't come in with a political agenda. They go and look at the facts and try to figure out what happened. I think that's the right approach, and that's certainly the approach that I'm going to take.
Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, we appreciate your time today, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.